Hi guys, welcome to the UEBC 2022 hosted by JPS here in Melbourne, Australia. I am joined by none other than Captain America himself, Mr. Dr. Eric Helms. Fantastic to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to sit down with me. So really just going off of your presentation, which was on periodization for hypertrophy, I wanted to get your thoughts on how you would approach periodization for maybe a gym pop client versus someone who has more kind of aesthetic goals versus then someone who is maybe looking at competing, maybe a physique athlete.
Right, that's a great question, and thank you. So I think the big thing to consider about periodization, implicit in the word is periods. So you're essentially breaking things down into larger time frames. And also, as I discussed in the presentation, there's also programming, which is probably what we're more familiar with and comfortable with. We're manipulating acute variables, we might changing the split. And when we're changing things on a week-to-week basis, that's typically the most you will need or potentially even benefit from when you're talking about general population clients. Periodization, as I described in the presentation, is something that should emerge from the demands and the constraints and the type of goal that you're trying to do. So when you have a goal that requires a very high level of training stress, very hard to get adaptations, then you do have to start thinking about things in a bigger picture sense. But when you're dealing with a general population client, or when you're dealing with someone who has an aesthetic goal, but is not necessarily training like a competitive bodybuilder, I don't think many of the tenets of periodization need to be incorporated into like a long-term plan. But more so you're thinking about those more acute things that I discussed, like fatigue management. If you're gonna be taking an approach that is, you're not seeing recovery from say session to session, and you're actually carrying fatigue from week to week, then some elements of periodization, like a planned deload, which you could argue as an element of periodization would come into play. But that's probably the extent of it that's occurring, that is true periodization at that earlier stage, or those less sport-like goals, compared to a bodybuilder versus an aesthetic client. I think some of the elements that I talked about in my presentation of how there seems to be a benefit of training across a slightly broader repetition range, you can accomplish that with programming strategies. You can have some days or some exercises that are higher in reps versus lower in reps. And you can get some of the same things that occur when you periodize without necessarily having to follow something that is truly kind of textbook periodized, if that makes sense.
Sure, so almost thinking as well that you could, instead of periodizing, let's say, a complete every aspect of a program in one, so going from, okay, in my 6-week training block, I'm gonna go from A completely to B, whereas you should look at it, or you can look at it as opposed to saying, I'm gonna go from A to B, but I'm gonna have this element of A because it's going well. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, exactly. So I think the reason why periodization is useful in sports science is because it gives us tools to organize a lot of different variables to accomplish a lot of things. Hypertrophy is not a performance outcome though. You have to train for it and it produces fatigue, but ultimately some of the principles and concepts that come from periodization are not a perfect fit. So the way you characterize it there is good. Like you don't necessarily have to have these drastic changes of A to B, especially when you're periodizing for hypertrophy. But more so we need to think about like, okay, we'll use this organizational tool, and then what are the things that I have to accomplish if my goal is truly to optimize hypertrophy or to make it as efficient as possible, which is probably only the goal of athletes, competitive bodybuilders, maybe some very serious clients with those types of goals. But once you're training 4+ days a week and you're incurring enough stress in your sessions to where you are at times overreaching, that's when you have to think about managing fatigue. So essentially like the big four, if you want to call them that, is like, okay, look, we probably need to be training hard enough that there are overreaching periods occurring. So therefore, I'm going to need to do some type of, pre-planned strategy to manage fatigue. It probably makes sense to be training across a range of rep ranges, which could be accomplished in a periodized or non-periodized strategy. And I also probably, if I really want to maximize my overall symmetrical hypertrophy from like a bodybuilding perspective, I need a fairly wide selection of exercises. Your typical client who wants to improve aesthetics, you get them their presses, their pulls, their hinges, their squats, and you sprinkle in a few accessory movements and you're good. But when you're going to be getting on stage mostly naked in front of 7 judges, then you're thinking about, well, is the short head of my bicep femoris growing? Is the long head of my triceps growing? Are my pulling upper body exercises really sufficient to get my biceps to grow? I need to do some calf raises. What about the clavicular head of my pectoralis major? Should I do some incline pressing?
Everyone's favorite head, for the record.
It's the best head.
It is true.
Yes. So ultimately, when you look at the demands of, like I said, periodization should emerge from the goals you set. And if you set the goal of optimizing symmetrical development, now all of a sudden you could technically, per se, not periodize your program and tick all those boxes. But it's kind of like going, you know what, I have a screwdriver here, periodization, and I have a little sheet of metal that I could fit into the screw and like really work my way in 3 hours. I'll eventually do what I could do in 5 minutes. Like, why don't I just use
the screwdriver?
The screwdriver, right? So I think when you look at it, it is it's basically how challenging is the goal of the client, and then what level of planning do I need? Because there's not, in my opinion, much of a difference between training planning and periodization. The difference between programming or just short-term planning and periodization or long-term planning is really just the time span. So I think most of the time, and for a large part of your career, if you're someone who's interested in improving your body composition, you just don't need to worry about the long-term planning. You tick the boxes, you work on progressive overload, you manage fatigue as it comes up, and you're good to go. But when you start to have phases of a sport like in-season, off-season, recovery, and when you're trying to go from a very well-developed to a champion level bodybuilder, now you're pushing the envelope a little more to the point where you have to consider all these factors.
And so just going back a bit, kind of, for me, putting together some of the pieces you've given me, so maybe you could look at it from a sense of, okay, well, I'm going to have this proactive approach to my clients' training. I'm going to periodize in advance. I'm going to plan out, okay, we'll probably need to deload here, but is it true in that what we see is that, okay, well, you're going to have to be ready to make a reactive response because in reality, things don't work out how we plan them. That's life. So how often would you say this kind of thing occurs, and what would your kind of thought process be there?
No, that's a great question. And ultimately, there's always the challenge anytime you want to teach from like a pedagogical perspective. You want to teach about periodization, then you give examples of structure, and it can sometimes be interpreted as, here's the periodization. Here's a top-down approach, and it must be that way. Yep. And unfortunately as well, if you look at some of the historical perspectives on periodization, sometimes they are a little too top-down, and the examples are things that, like you're forecasting performance months in advance, which we just simply can't do. So to be very specific to your question, the approach is typically, I'm going to create a plan where I am overloading over a given period of time, and I think we will probably need a deload maybe on week 4. But then you should probably have some diagnostic tool to actually assess, well, did that occur? Because it's very possible, if we think about all the biopsychosocial stresses that influence your recovery and your training stimulus and your perception of that, that you could reach that point earlier or later. In fact, it's probably just as likely that you will as that you'll hit it right on that 4th week.
Sure.
So how do we tell? And some of the things that I like to do in my practice is I get a gauge. I have a weekly report from a client, right? For myself, I am assessing essentially the total session RPE, if you will. How hard was that workout based upon how the same workout last week, but just creating some element of progressive overload, right? And when those numbers really start to not match up, or even though I'm doing the same number of sets, but just slightly more load or slightly more reps, and the session RPE is substantially higher, then we know that I seem to be incurring some debt cumulatively.
Sure.
That tool plus at the point when you're planning to do the deload, I like to do a block review. And I have a series of 5 or 6 yes or no questions. So is your sleep worse than normal? Or is your sleep worse than normal, yes or no? Is your motivation to go to the gym worse than normal, yes or no? Are your aches and pains worse than normal, yes or no? Are your loads actually decreasing, yes or no? And there's one other, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But
it's the best one.
Yeah,
He's missed it.
It's the one that will be the key to all your gains. Yeah. So it's sleep, motivation to train. Oh, general mood, like your stress levels. That's what it is. So when you look at the overtraining literature, you see that the typical metrics are psychometric in nature. The most validated questionnaires are the best predictors. And some of the things that happens in overtrained athletes is their sleep gets worse, which is both an outcome and a cause of overtraining. They are less motivated to train. They're more stressed. They experience psychological distress. Performance goes down. That's the actual definition of overtraining. So I ask those questions, and if you're only answering yes to maybe 1 or 0, and I have a planned deload, maybe we just keep going. You know, we recycle the block. You keep pushing the same variable that you're overloading if you have that type of approach a little more, and then you just delay the deload until it's actually needed. Because the idea of a deload is that it should be occurring after you have overreached.
Yep.
Right? It is a tool to manage fatigue, and if you haven't generated fatigue, then it's just an easier week of training, which sometimes is fine. But like one of the things, what I was mentioning earlier, is you probably don't need periodization for the more general population clients. You know this as a trainer, I know this as a trainer. Most of the time they're coming to see you 2 or 3 times a week for an hour. There's only so much you can do with 3 hours in a week. And I think it's not impossible. But with resistance training, it's extremely hard to put yourself in a position where you're training 2 to 3 days a week for 2 to 3 hours where you actually will need a deload, where you're carrying fatigue. I mean, more days of the week you're not training at all than you are training. So there's that factor. Even if you do have a novice or someone you're working with, and let's say they start coming to see you 4 times a week, a lot of the times they are maybe getting to the point where they're going to overreach, but then by the time they would get there, they have to take a vacation, or something happens in their family life and they have one of these unplanned easy weeks, so you don't actually need to prospectively or even reactively sometimes plan these deloads.
So it's like an informal deload.
Exactly. They end up not being able to come in as much, and there you go. They have dumped a lot of fatigue, and you can actually, that can serve you, and you think of it and you plan it into your big picture plan, and it's reactive in nature. When you're working with athletes, though, that is the time when you're probably going to need to think about these things. And I think having a lightly penciled in plan, and then being able, like you said, reactively modify when you do that deload, that's a great example of having structured flexibility in your approach to an element of periodization. You know, a planned deload technically is periodized.
And so, speaking a bit more kind of anecdotally here, maybe with some of the athletes you've had at 3DMJ, how long would it take you to tend to, or would you even get to the point where you have, okay, maybe I've worked with this client for a number of months, maybe it's been years. What's the kind of normal, or for you, the normal amount of time that you'd be able to start predicting how my client will respond to my training?
Yeah, probably the best example there, and this is a powerlifting example, is I've been working with Bryce Lewis since 2010. You know, and Bryce is, we have had a very, very similar approach, just, you know, modulating the total amount of stress and, you know, adapting to the given logistical constraints of his life for probably the last 6 years. So I'd say since 2015 or 2016, his training has been relatively similar, and he's still progressing. So obviously, I'm not just being lazy, I promise. So, but yeah, I don't think it would take someone 6 years to figure that out, but some patterns did emerge very early on. And I think one of the keys to figuring out like the patterns that you might observe in a client or an athlete is you have to fall upon something that would actually produces progress. And then once you have that framework and they're progressing, then you can start to see, okay, when we're doing enough for them to progress at something close to what we think is the fastest rate they can progress, at what rate do they also incur fatigue? That's of course modified by the approach you take, but for example, with Bryce, I know that every 4 weeks or so is typically when he's going to need a deload. Every 4th or 5th week, typically, you know. And occasionally it needs to happen a little earlier. Like for example, one anecdote I've seen with Bryce is that when the loads get heavier, the absolute loads and the RPEs, and we're doing more kind of intensity work, we're closer to a competition, that period of time gets truncated. So he's an athlete who struggles more with high loads than volumes necessarily. But I have other athletes who are the opposite. You know, you push volume on them a lot and all of a sudden things start to fall off. So I would say I started to observe those trends a couple years of working with them, to be honest. And that sounds like scary, like fuck, I gotta work with someone for 2 years. But I think you can fast track that process, because I didn't have a lot of the tools in place when I first started working with Bryce that I have now. Like that block review process. I mean, to be honest, the very first couple of years I was working with Bryce is we were taking existing programs and just modifying them because I wasn't confident enough to program. So I think if you have systems in place to, again, basically, how do I monitor at least subjective fatigue? Like you can look at, okay, their volume has gone up or this has gone up. We have these objective markers, and how do they feel and is their performance there? Those are like your 3 pillars. The monitoring of the actual external training load. Volume load could work, total number of sets, session RPE could give you that. Then some metric of performance. So that could be an estimated 1 RM from a high RPE single or a moderate RPE single in a power lifter, or it could just be rep performance for a bodybuilder. And then finally, some subjective but at least reliable, meaning you get similar outcomes on a regular basis, monitoring of subjective fatigue. Yep. So if you have those 3 things in place, I think you can fast track that process, cut it in half from what I said. Maybe in a year or 2 of working with an athlete, you're like, oh, I actually got my beat on them pretty well.
For sure. Yeah, awesome. So Eric, I wanted to finish off with a bit more of a fun question. So
sure.
For those that don't know, Eric is you're a bit of an all-rounder. You've done Highland Games to natural bodybuilding to powerlifting. I wanted to get your kind of idea on, let's say there's a sport that you've never quite been able to master, or a sport you'd always thought, man, I wish I was pretty good at that. What would it be and why? Weightlifting.
Even though I have tried weightlifting, so I did weightlifting consistently from 2013 to 2014. And then I came back to it, and I competed in Masters Nationals for New Zealand in 2020. And it is just such an elegant, high skill level, powerful athletic movement. So it is it's kind of like the high class of resistance training, And I've always wanted to be that. I'm not that. So I have like specific mobility restrictions in areas that no matter how much I stretch or work on it or how much I adjust my grip or widen my stance or whatever, seem to get in the way. Really, it just comes down to shoulder mobility for me. So, and also I don't have full lockout with my elbows. So between those 2 things, like I just can't get a powerful position.
Yep. So
I keep coming back to it because I want to be like the Liu Xiaojun, but I'm honestly never going to be. And it's not happening. Yeah. So it gives me an appreciation for how at a high level sport, there is certain selection criteria there,
For sure.
I see it in bodybuilding too. It's basically like a dog at a pony show. But for weightlifting, it's pretty cool to see. Like you need the hypermobility, high power output, resilience, and also a certain ability to not be afraid of getting under the bar, and also the ability to have a very tightly controlled like motor pattern. So it's pretty wild. I think it's a beautiful sport, and I would love to be beautiful, but I'm not. So
we at JPS would actually respectfully disagree with you on that one, Eric. It's been beautiful having you here. Beautiful man. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me, and thank you again for coming down from New Zealand to present here at the UEBC. Guys, if you missed Eric's presentation, stay tuned for the UEBC replay, which will be available via JPS. So keep an eye out on the socials for that one when it will be available. Otherwise, Eric, we're looking forward to hopefully having you here again soon. And guys, thank you again for tuning in.